All right, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Give me a thumbs up. Here's Megan with a thumbs up. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So excited to be here. This is session number 2 of Cypress, joining with Red Rover and presenting some of the things about test automation, specifically about Cypress, and this time about some of the choices that exist for users and companies of test automation that are in the market. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. This session is being recorded, and as a quick bit of housekeeping, we are going to use Slido. There's a couple of ways for you to get that, but Slido is for us to manage the questions that come in. You can post your questions. You can also upvote questions that you were wanting to ask, and that allows us at the end of the session in our reserved time for Q&A to be able to go through and really take the time to address the most requested items that are out there. So the link is in Zoom chat, but also if you've got a phone and want to access it that way, there's the QR code on the screen, as well as the code for Slido.com. I'll pause there for just another couple of seconds to make sure you all have that, and then off we go. All right. So looking at the agenda for what we have tonight is there's really 4 things, 4 major topics, and then the reserved time for Q&A at the end of the session. So we're going to be talking about the origins of test tools as well as the architecture behind those tools. And one of the things that I really hope that we learn together tonight is that those are very much related. And it's an important decision as you go and you decide what is the best test automation framework that exists for your company or for your software product. Once we've done that, we're also going to take a look at a matrix of similarities and difference between some of the popular tools that are out there in the market. And then we'll take a look at what happens when you have troubleshooting for test failures and why that's important. So as a way of introduction, there were 2 questions that came up in the session last week. And specifically, they were about what is the difference between Cypress and some of the other options that are out there. And specifically, the second one, what about Microsoft Playwright? And we're going to go through all of that in detail tonight. Now, a couple of things is this is a session. Obviously, we are from Cypress. And so that's what we do day in and day out. But we've derived this information from public market research, as well as blogs about the popular frameworks. We do have very passionate opinions and documentation, and you're going to find that all over our Cypress website and our documentations page and our social and our Discord group. So we're very passionate about what we do and why we do that. But tonight, hopefully you can see that it's really taking a step back and analyzing what are the options that exist out there and when might a particular solution be better for you in terms of not using a different tool. All right, so let's dive right in. First of all, the origins of the test tools that are on the market. And as we dive into this, we'll just take a step back and we'll think about this from a timeline perspective. And this timeline is in no way meant to be exhaustive, but it gives you just a glimpse into where we're headed tonight. And so Selenium wasn't necessarily the first, but they were a widespread adopter. When I started my career, Selenium was all people knew. That was all that they were using, even though other tools like Mercury, which was acquired and run by HP, there were certainly other options that were out there. But around 2004, Selenium began, and they went through an evolution of multiple iterations of their product. And so they had a merger with WebDriver, and that was around the 2008-2009 timeframe, and they began putting the 2 products together, and that released the Selenium WebDriver, which was Selenium 2, in the 2011 timeframe. Now, right around then, there was also the introduction of a protocol called CDP. And for those who are not familiar, it's in the footnote there, but it's a Chrome DevTools protocol. And it was initially developed to power the developer tools feature inside of Chrome. And that's really important for the conversation about the architecture and how things work that we'll get into tonight. Cypress, we'll go through the story of Cypress. It began in 2014 as an idea, launched in 2018, and at the same time, there were also a couple new entrants. Selenium, I guess not a new entrant, but they had a revision to their next gen 3. And then Puppeteer launched, and Puppeteer's from Google. And then finally, most recently, one of the big players is Playwright, and that came in the 2020 timeframe along with Selenium 4, which is, again, a continued evolution of the the Selenium product. So let's take a look at the protocols and let's understand exactly what they are and what that means. So first of all, we have a WebDriver concept. And so this is pretty simple in terms of it's an out-of-process program who has the capability of instructing the behavior of a web browser. And it's not really technically sound, but I always equate this to a remote control. I'll sit here and drive a remote control car or a drone around, and I'm not sitting there right there next to it. I can be in a different room or a different part of the house, but I can still be able to reach out, communicate, give a command to the car, the drone, and it does what I ask it to do, and it sends back a response. So that's where the analogy ends. But WebDriver is essentially a remote control protocol. It's over HTTP. It's a JSON protocol. And test runners use it to send commands over to the browsers. Now, what's really cool about the WebDriver protocol is it was adopted by W3C. So it's out there in the browsers that exist. And another benefit of using WebDriver is since you're really farther away from the browser, it does give you the capability to control a vast or a wider range of browsers. So as long as you have the necessary connection to the browser, you have the driver and the setup and everything that's necessary to be able to communicate with it, you could have the same set of code and in essence be able to communicate with a wider grouping of browsers that are out there. So that's protocol number one. Protocol number two is the DevTools protocol, CDP, and this is using a WebSocket connection. And this is the WebSocket's used for the test runner to be able to talk to the browser. So in some ways it's similar to the API approach, but what's unique is simply the difference between a WebSocket and an API. A WebSocket exists in order to really facilitate a chatty application that's a two-way street between two different parties. And so WebSocket allows for a lot more information to flow and to be exposed between the two parties. And so by using a WebSocket, there's more capability to have a richer set and a more advanced set of information that is available to the test runner. This was implemented by Chromium, and it's also been implemented by Firefox. Now, JavaScript in a browser would be the third, and I'll call this a protocol, but it's the third method that we're going to be looking at tonight about how a test runner can operate. And there are three things that are really unique about the JavaScript in a browser approach. The first of all is that the application that you're testing and the test code itself, they share the same process. They're running in the same domain. And so what that means is that the third bullet here is the test runner is able to have direct access to the DOM, to the application objects, to the APIs, in order to get a lot of information that otherwise is not available to a test runner. And the way it works is simply a handshake approach. You have an alternating set of turns between the test code that runs, issues a command, the application goes and does the command, returns back control to the test, and it just continues to do that until the test has completed. So with that in mind, and those are the major protocols, let's take a look at the popular automation testing tools that exist out there in the market. And in terms of tonight's presentation, we're really going to focus our attention on four of the major test tools that seem to be getting the most attention. So first of all on the list, we have Selenium. And so with Selenium, we talked about on the timeline, it was the first major entry into the market. And it was the product of ThoughtWorks back in 2004. Now, this line, in terms of the naming of Selenium, I always wonder, people ask, where did the name come from? And in my book, this is the most genius marketing name ever. The individual who was leading up the initiative for Selenium, they were competing with Mercury at the time. And so he just said in an email, we can solve mercury poisoning with selenium supplements. And his team that received that took the email and they just ran with it. And they were like, this is a really cool idea. And it became the name of the tool from then on out. It's always been Selenium. And then Selenium itself is open sourced. Now, what is happening with Selenium is A couple of things here. So it has outside orchestration of test from a centralized server, and it operates over the browser drivers. It's also a suite of software. If you go to their website, you'll find that there's multiple different products that you can download. It'll talk about Grid, it'll talk about IDE, it'll talk about their actual WebDriver. But since they've had so many iterations over time, depending on which version you're looking at, the answers are going to be a little bit different. But really, WebDriver is the key one that is used, and it does not need the proxy server. But when you use Selenium Grid, which is the server that sits off to the side to orchestrate all the testing, then of course you would be, orchestrating all that testing from that, from that server itself. And we talked about the merger between WebDriver and Selenium in 2011, and the fact that they implement the W3C standard for WebDriver. So Selenium, and we'll talk more about their capabilities here in a minute, but that's the first entrant. The second one that we want to think about is Puppeteer. And so a few things about Puppeteer is it's a Node.js library, and it allows you to control Chrome or to control Chromium from the command line. It was developed as an internal tool, and you're going to see this is a theme in our presentation tonight, for internal use in order to allow developers to automate different workflows. And it was introduced in 2017. All right. And in terms of Puppeteer, one thing that's really unique about it is it's really automation tool first and a test tool second, but it's popular and used as a test tool. And the reason for that is it can do a lot of stuff that's very generic, and you can use it in a lot of different ways, not just to test a software application. So you can use it for web scraping, you can use it for automation, generating PDFs, and obviously for testing, as well as a host of other things. Now, Puppeteer, in terms of its capabilities, you're going to see a lot of similarities between Puppeteer and the next tool that we're going to take a look at. And the next tool is Playwright. All right, so Playwright. Why it's very similar in a lot of aspects to Puppeteer is very simple. A number of the individuals who authored Puppeteer came over to Microsoft and they developed the tool. It launched in 2020. And so what is one of the things that they wanted to address is with Playwright, it feels a lot like a test automation tool, not just the automation tool, which is more of where Puppeteer is viewed. And so a few things that are interesting here about Playwright is it's able to do a lot of things that it's known for. So you can work with a shadow DOM, very strong in CSS selectors. In terms of testing, in terms of writing the test code, we're going to have a comparison tonight between some of the aspects and maintenance of Playwright test and the Cypress test. And you're going to see some things there that are going to be quite similar. Now, Playwright, they did a great service for the test automation industry, and they really worked to get support for Safari for WebKit. And that's something that you'll see Cypress also follow suit and introduce our own support for WebKit. But the thing about Playwright is it is maintained by Microsoft. And so because it's a Microsoft product, there's going to be widespread adoption in the Microsoft ecosystem. And that is exactly what we have seen. So Playwright, even though it's a Microsoft product, it is open source. It's also a fully managed service that launched just last year. So Microsoft has launched the commercial aspect to this. And it's got a very tight integration with VS Code. So if you are a Microsoft developer, if you're using Microsoft toolset, the capability of using Playwright is right there in front of you as an easy integration. Now, a couple of things, and we're going to see a chart here that looks at the trajectory of some of these tools. There is Playwright Library and there's Playwright Test. And so this is from the Playwright website directly. And really the difference is this. You have the Playwright Library that is the main aspect, the main library that does everything. However, on top of that, you now have built Playwright Test. And so Playwright Test is the library plus the fully managed test runner in the experience. And so the IDE that you would use, some of the capabilities that you're going to see inside of Playwright, all of that is from the Playwright Test. And so for an apples to apples comparison, if you were to go out to NPM and looked, Playwright Test is the library that gives you the full suite of test capabilities. You could use Playwright Library simply to do some of the screen scraping and PDFs and same capabilities that you could have done with Puppeteer. All right, there's one more that we want to talk about, Cypress. I think we know a few things about Cypress, and so we'll walk you through just a bit of the story. First of all, the thing that is unique about Cypress, and we'll get into this a bit further, but it's the automation framework that runs inside of the browser. Why is that important? Hold on that. We'll talk about the benefits and pros and cons in a minute. Cypress itself, we support the Chrome family of browsers, including Edge and Electron, Firefox, and then we also added the support for WebKit. It's listed as experimental. It's been out there as released and experimental for quite some time. And we're just not taking the experimental tag off because we're continuing to evaluate additional features that may need to be added. But right now, we have the WebKit support out there in the market. The focus of programming, so a bit of the backdrop for Cypress is a long time ago, programming migrated from the server to the browser. But at the time, the tools that were available to debug and test applications, they hadn't changed. And so there was a pain point that existed. And so you had, the next generation of web, the Web 2.0, with all these companies that very dearly. They all started to use the micro application approach, which meant that they're a lot more complicated. You got a lot more interactions and things going on within the page. And so as one of the outputs of that is page asynchrony becomes a key challenge to a modern testing framework. And really, that's one of the key things that drives flakiness is trying to deal with the asynchrony on a page. And is an element available? Is it ready for me to interact with at the time when my test is running? So in terms of Cypress, that's why Cypress was created. It was an internal tool, just like we talked about a minute ago with the Google side of things. But Brian Mann, the founder of Cypress, simply wanted to build something that his team was able to use internally. And the story on the Cypress name is it's not about a selenium pill, but in terms of testing, all of the tests should always pass. And so in other words, they should be green. If you think about what's green, well, Cypress tree comes to mind. And so that was the name. Cypress was born. And so what happened was after the internal tool was developed for Brian and team, they began to see a traction after Brian was guest speaking and introducing this to some of the key companies that became early adopters of Cypress. A little bit more about Cypress is we do run in the browser. And so because of that, we do have access to all the information in those three things, especially the DOM. Cypress finally has a holistic testing platform. And so a few things of what that means is we provide components, integration, as well as end-to-end test. And you'll see that a little bit later in a matrix of capability. A lot of you are likely very familiar with end-to-end test. Integration test expose how your product, how your software is using the backends and other browsers. However, component testing is a new capability that Cypress has added to allow you to really test the components that are reused throughout your application. A couple things I'll point out here. I'll speed along. So customization is available through a large number of plugins, and we'll see a page a bit in the presentation. But the plugins that are available, they extend Cypress behavior. There's both official plugins as well as there's community plugins. But when you extend the behavior, it's all done within Cypress and within our ecosystem. And so by using that, you're going to find all the data that's generated, all the testing that takes place. You're still able to have access to the results and to make use of that in Cypress Cloud. We also include capabilities like test replay accessibility, UI coverage. And so for those of you who were with us last week, you should be very familiar. And if you missed last week's session, you'll be able to find the link from Red Rover. It's posted out there on YouTube to understand exactly what that means from a Cypress perspective. But it allows us to have a fully integrated testing platform. So it's a one-stop shop. You can customize it, you can configure it with plugins, but it's a full suite of capability that's available to you to make use of. All right, last slide on the timeline and the trajectory of the different applications. So just glancing at this for a moment, this is looking at the last 5 years of the tools, and it's looking at the ones that we've walked through tonight. So we have the Playwright Test, Cypress, Puppeteer, and Selenium WebDriver. And just taking a step back and looking at this for a minute, a couple things really come to mind. The first is if you look at the red line for Selenium WebDriver, there does appear to be a trend there in terms of the number of downloads and usage of Selenium WebDriver. So it did peak, and it's been on a bit of a downward slant. Cypress and Puppeteer have been pretty high, similar trajectories, the green and the yellow lines there. And lastly, if you look at this Playwright, launched in 2020, and it really started to ramp up and it's had significant growth, especially as of late. And so Playwright is doing very well in terms of download and new users. Cypress, where we're seeing a lot of our expansion, is from existing companies. And so they already have the framework and the capabilities in place, but we're seeing a lot of our additional traffic and activities coming from users within companies that have already been using Cypress. A bit of stats there that show about the 4 different downloads. However, we will move on to the next topic, which is the test tool architecture. So architecture, should I test inside or outside of the browser? And the approach is quite different. So what are some of the pros and cons that exist? So first of all, if you think about outside of the browser, it's outside control. So a page loads, you have the HTTP request and response, you get the page, then will reload based on an action that takes place. And so with the introduction of SPA apps, the browser page does not reload every time. It's just portions of the page that are able to refresh. And so the DOM is re-rendered, but how do you know when you're ready to execute the next test step? And that's a difficult challenge, not just for outside the browser. It's a difficult challenge in general, but it is harder in this scenario. And so flakiness can tend to be a concern. Hopefully you're familiar. If not, flakiness is just unpredictable results. It'll pass sometimes. The same test will other times fail, and you have to figure out and understand why is that happening? Why is it not predictable? One thing about outside the browser is it might be better for multiple tab and for heavy iframe testing. And the reason for that is simply you're further away from the browser. So if you've got multiple tabs that are taking place or you have a big use of iframe, you do have a capability of, instead of being inside the browser tab with the application, you have more capability in order to be able to address that. That was one of the things that Cypress had to address, and it's one of the reasons that we introduced a plugin just last year that allows our community to be able to test multi-tab, because up until last year in 2023, multi-tab testing was not a capability of Cypress being inside the browser. WebDriver, CDP, and Chromium browsers. So a couple of things about them. They provide better support for running the same test on different browsers and versions. And we talked about this briefly before, but CDP, because it's the WebSocket protocol, it provides a lot more information. And because of that, it has more advanced capabilities. All right, so a little bit more outside the browser, the tools that we've already talked about that are from this camp are Playwright and Puppeteer. So both Playwright and Puppeteer, they utilize WebSocket connections or CDP. And there's many similarities between the tools like we talked about, and the reason is their origins. You have Google and their product, which then morphed into the creation of Playwright through Microsoft. Outside of the browser is also Selenium, but they're not using WebSockets to do their work. They're using the WebDriver API in order to be able to interact with the web browser. And so they basically translate the test into JSON, send it to the browser, execute it, and receive a response back. And then, no surprise, inside the browser, Cypress is the company, the product that does inside the browser testing. And the way that we do that is we inject the test code as it's written directly into the browser. Now, what's interesting about that is and this is straight from our documents site that we have. You'll find Cypress has very strong documentation and guides and helpful tips that are out there. But we also have a trade-offs page, and this is straight from that page. There's a lot of power in being able to run inside the browser, but at the same time, by doing that, there are some trade-offs and things that you really cannot or should not do through the use of Cypress. And so performance testing and scripting of third-party websites would be examples of things that you really would not use Cypress for. And if this is your use case, then Cypress may not be the best tool. And we try to be very transparent about that in terms of our documentation. Now, we also recognize that there was cases where getting access to CDP, even though we run inside the browser, would be helpful. And so that was something that we've made capabilities to expose as well. All right, and then one thing I just wanted to highlight before we leave the topic of inside or outside the browser is the technology and the architecture of running inside versus outside can have impacts on the tests themselves. And one of the examples that we had here at Cypress, and this was recent, this was in the last 3 or 4 months, I believe. It was last quarter. And one of our large enterprise customers, they had errors that were taking place in their CI pipeline. The errors were not happening local, and they were having a whale of a time figuring out exactly what was going on. They were also using another framework, another testing tool, and that testing tool was not having the issues. It was not failing. It was not running into any problems. And so the natural reaction or response was that there was a problem with the Cypress test or with the Cypress implementation in their environment, and that was the cause of the failure. And what we found through investigating with them is there were actually components that were being used, third-party libraries, which were leading to the failure condition. And the only way that that was exposed and actually experienced was by running from within the browser. And so if you think about that as a customer, the opportunity to catch something and to fail in the exact way that a customer would be using the application, there's some benefits to that. And so that's one of our experiences that we did find. And so because of that, I would say a bonus tip is don't let flake when you do see it. Sometimes a test fails, sometimes it passes. Don't let the flake by itself determine your decision or steer you in a direction of looking at a tool. Realize that flake does have a lot of causes, and those causes, if you decide to change to a different tool, they may very well just follow you over to the new tool. So it's very important to always understand the root cause of what's going on with your test and why they're failing. And that's why the architecture is so important to the product that you choose for your automation. Couple of comments there. I'm going to speed through that and keep us moving in the interest of time. Next one is capability matrix. And so here we're going to be taking a look at some of the capabilities that exist across these 4 tools that we've already discussed. And so this information is sourced from late 2023, earlier this year. It's intended as a general guidance for this session. What's crazy about it is the minute we finish typing it, it's probably out of date. It's constantly changing. New technologies are coming out. New rows will be added to the matrix. However, would love interactions tonight. If you have a different experience or a different point of view, love to see that. And Cypress will capture that and use that to inform future sessions that we also do. So a few slides here looking at the test capabilities for Cypress, for Playwright, for Puppeteer, and for Selenium. So first of all, we have the languages that are supported. And this one we have first for a reason is you have a specific language that you are wanting to use to test. And if that language does not match up to this table, you probably are going to be steered in a specific direction. So if JavaScript is your language, you have a lot of choices. However, if Ruby and PHP are your choices, you might start looking a little bit more intently at Selenium. But these are the languages that are documented as being supported by the various tool sets. There's also different browsers that are supported. So there's similarities on the first 3 with the Chromium family of browsers as well as Firefox. And then Cypress and Playwright have added the WebKit capability as well. Selenium, because it's running outside of the browser and it's using the WebDriver, it's able to interface with a lot of browsers. assuming that you have the environment set up and the drivers that are able to communicate with those browsers. Flake reduction, and I'm not talking about detection of flake, which is a feature that Cypress has. That's a bit unique, but the reduction itself, I didn't put answers in here for Puppeteer and Selenium. There's certainly aspects that are being done to reduce flake, but this is something that Cypress and Playwright are known for. And it's called auto weighting in Playwright. In Cypress world, it's actionability, and we also have retryability. And essentially, what that means is Cypress runs inside the browser. Because of that, we have some capabilities that the other tools don't, but we all have the same challenges of making sure that things are available to test when the test code executes. And so if something is not there, wait for it or continue to retry. If you build in those guardrails, you have a lot more stability in terms of your test executing properly and being able to succeed. And so the two test tools of Cypress and Playwright have certainly done quite a bit in terms of making sure that you're able to test and to not have that flag. In terms of community and support, you'll see there webinars, blogs, Discord, and ambassadors. Some similarities between Cypress and Playwright and the size of the community. Selenium's been around forever, so the community is massive. Puppeteer, because it's multi-purposed, the community might exist in different forms and different locations. There's a lot of users of Puppeteer out there, but in terms of a community focused on the testing aspect, this is what we have. From a support perspective, one thing that is unique about Cypress as well as Selenium, although Selenium does it a bit different, is there's the standard OSS open source support. There's also the premium paid support that we offer here with Cypress for an organization that needs or wants the additional help and tips and suggestions from Cypress. Playwright is newer, launched again in 2020. They're still building aspects of that, and in Puppeteer, they have the open source support. Docs and guides, this is something Cypress is super proud of, and I've talked about it even a couple of times tonight, but the documentation site that we have, I would consider a best in class. It has everything out there that you can find. It's not just the syntax about the test, it is about guides and tips and tricks and tutorials and training and moving you into the Discord community and interacting with your fellow testers. All of that exists with Cypress, and it's one of the things that we are certainly known for. And Playwright, again, they have established that. Their documentation is quite good. They're still building some of the other aspects around that, being a newer player. Same with Puppeteer and then with Selenium. Moving on to another slide, looking at a few more capabilities, is the ability to customize in plugins really exists across all these tools simply because they're all open source. And when you're open source, that capability typically lives there for the taking. And so you can bundle and package things together. But in terms of the plugins, that's something that's also I'm very proud of with Cypress. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, this is from our documentation site. You'll find that we have a tab devoted to the plugins that are available, and it scrolls endlessly with both approved and community-based plugins that are available. So if you want to be able to customize and tailor exactly what your capabilities are in testing, there's plugins that likely exist already that you can make use of with Cypress. Architecture, we talked about that. So Cypress is the one that is in browser. We have two that are CDP, and we have Selenium as WebDriver. And all of us, we all do video recordings, screenshots, and logs, as well as we all have CI and CD integration. So on the integration side of things, so integrations is essentially being able to interface with third-party products. And so in a Cypress world, that would be, I have a test that fails and I want to issue a ticket into Jira, or I want to notify a team through Microsoft Teams or through Slack. Those are the types of integrations that exist naturally in Cypress. And so that's the benefit there. There are libraries and ways that you can bundle that in, again, since all the tools are open source. Parallelization is something that Cypress we offer in cloud. Playwright does offer that natively, and they allow one machine to be used for the parallelization. Cypress Cloud, we do allow a limited number of machines that you would spin up in CI. All right, And then lastly, mobile device. So one that sticks out here, and this is a question that did come in ahead of time. And so I'm glad to see that. And the question was about Appium. And Selenium does support and can be used very well with Appium. So if you are a mobile device developer and that is what your product is, and you're concerned with some of the different sensors or hardware capabilities of a mobile phone, you need pinch and zoom and some of the just natural gestures, then that's something that you would take a look at using Appium. The other products, Cypress, Playwright, and Puppeteer, they have emulation, and Playwright is also looking at some experimental support of Android right now. In terms of recording, we all have it. It's all called different things, but this is a great way to get started in writing a test. If you've not used the framework before and you want to really understand how to create test code for that, you simply run your application, you point and click, and test code is generated for your test suite. And so we call it Cypress Studio. There's the names of the offerings from the other tools. And then component testing is the last one. So I talked about this and being able to test your components that are spread throughout your app. That's available with Cypress from last year, and then experimental currently is the status with Playwright. All right. We are speeding our way through one last section here, which is troubleshooting tests that fail. And so the whole point of a good test framework is to know that you're protecting the quality of your application. As a developer, you're making sure that what you develop works and that you're going to be efficient and not have to go back later and fix something. As you make a change, you want to make sure that there's been no breaking changes to that portion or even other portions of the application. So a failure is a good thing in terms of catching it before it goes out to the world. However, when a failure happens, how do you troubleshoot that? So a few things here. First of all, you've got logs and videos and screenshot artifacts. And this is consistent across all the tools, and it gives you a bit of an idea of what's going on. You can see a video of the actual test running and be able to go and figure out, where is the proximity of the issue. The logs will tell you some more information as well. With Selenium and Puppeteer, a third-party service could be purchased. And what I mean by that is Playwright and Cypress have built-in capabilities to do a replay of tests. Those are not available as options for these two. However, there are products on the market that can be purchased to facilitate this. Cypress, we call it test replay. Playwright, they calls it trace viewer. There are differences between the two tools, but they both try to aim for the same target, which is essentially being able to see not a video, but an interactive DOM of what was going on at the time when the test was taking place. And so by having those, you're able to identify and fix the code or fix the test, and then be able to issue the retest. Now, one thing I would recommend from a Cypress perspective is definitely take a look at two features and enable those. One is spec prioritization, and the other is auto cancellation. And what that means is, especially if you're paralyzed and running across a bunch of machines, but you're fixing a test that previously failed, you might want to run that spec of test first and make sure that it passes before you proceed through the rest of your test suite. And if it does fail again, auto cancellation will prevent the rest of your test suite from running, and you get absolute immediate results. In terms of test replay, and again, what Playwright is looking to provide through their trace viewer is essentially this capability here. So this is with Cypress. It's completely built in. It's all integrated into the Cypress Cloud solution. So it's all there together along with your test results. But you can see here that we're able to not only understand the test that took place, and you can time travel through the test. You can see the network and the everything, the console logs that were taking place in the browser, but you can also interact with this application and be able to interface directly with the DOM to understand exactly what's taking place. All right, so all that to bring us to some really important conclusions. So 5 points here, and that's it, and we go to Q&A. First of all, I can't emphasize this any more than this, is the choice between Cypress or other tools. It's a journey, it's not a destination. There's things that you have to consider and take into account as you make this decision. And those are essentially this, what is your team skill set? What is their experience level and familiarity with various tools? Have they used it previously in a different job? What is the overarching goal of what you're trying to achieve? And how do you want to maintain and look at the readability of your test? The different tools, they all have different syntax and ways of writing the test. And so that's another question that came in about syntax and maintainability. We can talk about that in the Q&A section. But never choose a tool that doesn't match the skill set of your team. This one's kind of a no-brainer. Is your product a web-based application? If it's not, you're probably in the wrong presentation. If it is, then you certainly want to continue to look at the options that exist here. But if you're looking at just a console-based application that's maybe a .NET app, that's you're not going to be using Cypress or Playwright for that. Do you require additional language support, such as Java or C#? Again, if the answer is yes, Cypress is not the tool for you. If that's the bulk of what you're looking to test, Cypress, as we saw in the matrix, is based on JavaScript and TypeScript. And that's what we're known for, and that's what we specialize in. So this is a major consideration for you as you choose. Multi-browser reliability and flakiness. And so this is just an illustration. It's not hard science, but you have really a spectrum here. You have cross-browser supports, and then you have on the other side less flake. And so there's a sequence or a progression of the different protocols. You've got WebDriver protocol. It's got more capabilities for cross-browser, but it's got more aptitude for flake. CDP is kind of in the middle, and then JavaScript that runs in the browser, which is Cypress. Opportunity there for less flake, but we talked about some of the capabilities of cross-browser testing is harder, and why we had to introduce a plugin specifically for the multi-tab testing. And then lastly is look at what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish, and determine the major features that you really need to hit the target with. Is it simply the shift left approach of allowing the developers to have the confidence and know that there's coverage in the application? Is it the confidence of knowing that your application is not going to break in front of a customer? Or are you also looking at application quality? Things that we talked about in the last session, not just the test replay for debugging, but if we look at the Cypress accessibility or the Cypress UI coverage, those are aspects that are only available through Cypress as a bundled application. If you use Cypress, it's just a gimme. It's available for you there, but you have to decide, is that something that is a factor for me as I evaluate different tools that are out there in the market? And with that, I believe we are at the end. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that we have many questions out there in Slido. So if you haven't put your question, now is your opportunity. And I'm going to turn this over to Megan, who is our expert at walking us through and keeping us all moving through Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. That was a great presentation. I think one of the cool things about being in this space is and in testing in particular, is it is a choose your own adventure, right? And I think you did a phenomenal job of showing yes, we represent Cypress on this call, but is that the right choice for you? That's up to you to determine. So I think giving a holistic view to the testing space makes a ton of sense. We have just a couple questions in Slido. So if anybody else has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I will do my best to navigate those and facilitate a bit of a conversation here as well. But one of the main things I wanted to start with is one of the questions we had waiting for us in Slido. Is Cypress the easiest way to automate tests, and how can you improve the test maintenance with that framework? Mark, do you want to answer that one for us? Oh, Mark is on mute, I think, still. So we're going to see if who can come off mute first. I like this. This is good. Eric, thoughts on that? Oh, he's not allowed to unmute. There we go. Let's see if I can
They are both co-hosts. You should be able to do it now, Mark.
Oh, okay.
We're unmuted. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I like this question. And the first part of it is kind of difficult to say for somebody else. So it was certainly the easiest way for me. Cypress was the first testing framework that I kind of grokked. I had heard about testing and was learning JavaScript and everything, you know, kind of from around 2015 onwards, and was just getting serious about it and stuff like that when I got a hold of Cypress. Testing was really confusing, so having something that integrated the other dependencies like Mocha and Chai for assertions and everything, that made it really easy for me to take it on along with the docs. But I think depending on your background, like which one is easier is kind of depending which thing you're already closer to the model for.
Yeah.
But so that's it certainly can be the easiest, and it is I would say good on-ramp for somebody new to testing for sure. For the other half, the question about like improving the maintainability of tests in Cypress, I have way more than we can talk about now, but I tried to think of like the most important things about this. And for me, there are a couple things to alert people to. So I tried to make some notes as we were finishing up the talk here, Dan. The first thing I think is your locators for your elements have a massive influence on whether your tests are maintainable. So that means as you get an element with Cypress to click it or to assert something about it, you have a choice between using something like a CSS selector to locate it that's targeting a class name, or even something more deep like, nested, this div has to be inside of this div and a direct child of this other li or whatever. And the other option is like more accessible locators like testing library provides, which you can use in Cypress, or even just sci.contains. I use that all the time to get an element by its text. And so I'll often say for a button that like achieves some action like saving the user's input, I'll use the specific format of locator that is sci.contains button and then the text of the button. So I know for sure I'm getting a real button element and it's got a particular text, and that's what I'm trying to find. I'm not trying to find a particular locator of where it is in the DOM. And what I think people miss about the locator of the element is that it's really becomes part of the spec that you're writing. So you are specifying whatever path you use to get the element. If it's a complicated long CSS selector, what you're saying is my application is not behaving correctly if that element doesn't satisfy that entire chain of things that helps you find it, like an XPath. And what you're saying is I want my test to fail when the designer moves it 1 pixel, or up a level in the nesting or changes the CSS class. So that's what that does is it creates brittleness, and it's hard to maintain because you're constantly keeping up with these insignificant changes and you feel like testing is painful. So the most important thing about the locator is to make it something that your users care about. If you are using the button like element name, that's great. Buttons are accessible. They have keyboard behavior for clicking, with the enter key or with the space bar. They have all this stuff that comes for free. And then the text that matters to the user. At that point, your test is still like, it'll still break, but it'll break for the reason that matters to the experience. And then for like the ultimate in stability, you can use test IDs, but you almost go too far if you only use test IDs, because then you can lose things that matter to the user without your test noticing. So locators is the first thing. And the next thing I thought about was just reusable commands for repetitive stuff. So not too much to talk about there, but if you have a login script or something like that, you just want to abstract that into a function. Don't repeat it as much as you need to. And if possible, for something that's really repeated, if you can programmatically do it instead of going through the UI, you can save a bunch of time. So that means you might do the full login process once where you go through the interface and you type the username, password, you make sure that works. And then for every other test, you just save and restore that session so that you're not actually having to repeat all of the time it takes to do those steps every single test. And the last thing, I think component testing has a special place in my heart because that's the first team I was on at Cypress. And what I developed as I worked on component testing, was this attitude to testing at the right level. So where does it matter to find the feedback? If you need feedback to reach developers as they're changing components and doing that local short feedback loop lifecycle, I would push as much as you can into that level if it's going to help someone to find the feedback on their machine and it's possible to detect at the component level, versus the end-to-end tests that are more like user journey focused, and you really have to have the whole system running so you can verify the user gets all the way through these workflows. But a lot of like, hey, is this part of the page correct? Where you load an entire page and you then try to find a particular part of the footer and do something and assert it. And then you load the whole page again and find another part and you do something, and you're just like focused on one thing at a time. If you push that stuff down a level into component tests of those parts of the page, but it's not really a user journey, you can make your tests a lot faster and easier to maintain because they're co-located with the exact code that goes with it. So those are my three things that I made notes for: the locators, the reusable commands, and choosing the right level to test at.
That's great. I love that thorough answer. I think it gives a little bit for everybody here. Eric, I would love to hear, as long as you can come off mute too, your opinion on this from your perspective at Cypress.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I work in support here at Cypress. So I'm fielding a lot of customer questions when they have issues or just general questions. So for the first part of this about, is Cypress the easiest? As you can see, there are a lot of choices out there. We went over kind of the top 4. And my thoughts on this are, you can read as many comparisons or guides or watch as many webinars as you want. But for most things, including this, I would give them each a try and figure out what's going to work for you, unless you look at our simplified matrix we had and figured out, I need to use Python, so I can't use Cypress for that reason. If something like that rules it out immediately, then that kind of narrows it down. But instead of getting the information overload from reading everything, I would try them each out. People are going to have preferences and they're going to write articles or guides based on that. So I encourage everyone to try them and form your own opinion. So, and then for the second part of that, how can we improve the test maintenance on this framework? I'm going to take that from the viewpoint of support. So a lot of times we'll see people coming in asking for help because maybe some maintenance was deferred specifically within Cypress. My brief advice there would be, don't get too far behind on upgrading versions. It's a lot easier to take little bite-sized chunks of upgrading along with Cypress as we upgrade. You don't necessarily have to be on the latest and greatest the day it comes out, but if you're staying up to date, it becomes a lot easier to upgrade your test suites rather than jumping from, Cypress 5 to 13. And if you do end up in that situation, we can help, or Discord community members can help, but we have migration guides and tools to make that easier for you. But my advice there would be, take that in bite-sized pieces and upgrade along with the Cypress versions, because we're always releasing new features. And if there are breaking changes, it's a lot easier to upgrade along with that incrementally rather than one giant leap at a time. But like I said, if you end up in that situation, we all do sometimes, we can help you out with that with our docs and support as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think the feedback I would give there as well, around the testing community is it's a community. And I think all 4 tools we showcased tonight all have platforms and community platforms and all sorts of things for people to talk and have conversations and solution together, which I think is such a cool aspect of being in tech. You can read on, fall down in all sorts of Reddit rabbit holes with testing. You can jump in Discord servers. You can do lots of things, but I think at the end of the day, getting your hands a little dirty and trying them all, to figure out what works best for you is such a good experience. And you'll find exactly what it is you are looking for, what is important to you in your testing journey, and then you're able to select a tool based on that. So Dan, I know we are running close to our time limit here. We didn't really have any other things we didn't already answer in Slido, and no other things in the chat. So I think that's it for us tonight.
Awesome. And I love that last question. Easiest way to automate tests. One other thing I would add is focus on both sides of it. Focus on what it takes to automate the test, and then focus about how you troubleshoot when a test does fail, because they're both critically important. You're writing tests for that purpose. And so make sure that you're evaluating both of those, and I think you'll come up with a very good very good solution. That said, if there's no other questions, thank you all for joining, letting us walk through some of the options that are available to us in the market, and wherever you're at, have a very great evening. All right, bye all.